Hello, Bio20, and welcome to Ecosystem Interactions, where we're going to look at some biotic factors. This is the first video of two, so let's get started. What we're going to be learning today is how to define the different levels of the biosphere and how they're interrelated, as well as explain trophic levels and in the food chains and food webs. So the importance part of this lesson, how do you know you've accomplished this lesson, is being able to explain the difference between eating levels, or what we call trophic levels. Explain the difference between a food chain and a food web within different types of ecosystems, as well as explain how to label a food web, both using their trophic levels and their primary, secondary, and tertiary consumer labels. So let's look again at ecosystems. So we've defined ecosystems quite a few times. It's the interaction of both abiotic and biotic factors and organisms all in one. So it's the area they live in, the physical environment, the water, the minerals, the sunlight, and all the other non-living things within that area. Now, when we have living and non-living things interacting, they self-regulate the system. They essentially create what we call limiting factors, where they put a limit on how much in the population is going to grow. And what ends up happening is, as it regulates, energy is passed through and matter is cycled around. So what do I mean by that is, if you know the second law of thermodynamics, the first law states that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, only transferred, and that most energy is lost to heat. So what we talk about with energy is we talk about energy moving through the ecosystem, because we can't create it or destroy it, we just transfer it. But matter such as carbons, oxygens, water, minerals such as nitrates and phosphates, and organic materials such as when animals decompose, that's all cycled. Think The Lion King, the circle of life, right? Where we eat the antelope eat the grass. When we die, the antelope eat the grass that the soil has been fertilized by the decomposing of the animals, that thing, okay? That is what we talk about, cycling of matter. So we're going to start by looking at basically the feeding levels or trophic levels to start to get this idea of how our biotic factors or organisms interact within an ecosystem to cause these essentially limiting factors to work. So defining trophic levels means describing the feeding relationships in the ecosystem. Trophic meaning food, trophic level meaning feeding level. So if we look at this little lovely food chain, here's my sun, here's my plants, and all these, I would call this my primary producer, or my first, or an autotroph. What eats this is known as the primary consumer, then the secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and here we have a quaternary consumer, so we have more than three. If I was to take this food chain and label it with trophic levels, it's the first feeding level. So the first feeding level would actually be the primary producer. So I would call that trophic level 1. This would be trophic level 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, this lovely guy right here, this decomposer, he can feed at any level, so we try not to give him too much of a trophic level because it's hard to define him as level 6, because he's not. That literally eats anything that decomposes down. So that's how a trophic level works. Now, in a food chain, we're looking at modeling a linear pathway which the energy that is passed from one producer to the primary consumers to higher trophic levels. So you'll see here that this is labeled, and this is what I mean by proper labeling of a food chain. You'll notice here are my plants. Now, this is a marine food chain, and this is a terrestrial food chain. So there is a difference. Marine food chains tend to be deep water, so you're not going to have a lot of plants growing. So you have something called phytoplankton. Phyto, okay, meaning plant, and plankton is a really small organism. Zoo means animal, and plankton, so these are really small plankton that are animals. So phytoplankton is our primary producer, and our plant is our primary producer in our terrestrial. You'll notice it's labeled the first trophic level. So this is the proper labeling of a food chain. You'll also notice my arrows are going up, showing the movement of energy through the ecosystem. So here I have my primary consumers with my second trophic level, secondary consumers with my third trophic level, my tertiary consumers, my fourth, and then quaternary consumers with my fifth. So what we're talking about in a food chain is how is energy moved up the food chain to larger and larger carnivores, all right? And in a marine food chain, this is pretty set. Like it's very rare you're going to find a lot of other organisms interacting to make a very large food web, but you might see that here. So we're going to draw a diagram of the terrestrial food chain in your notes. So something like a grass, which would be producers, which would be trophic level 1, you would have as your first organism. Now, remember the sun is causing the energy for that plant. It's beating down, photosynthesis is occurring, energy is made. Now we're using our arrows to show where our energy is going. I made energy, it's going to be consumed over here by my grasshopper, my primary consumer, or what we would call trophic level 2. So there's my grasshopper. Its energy is being transferred to a mouse, which is my secondary consumer, or trophic level number 3. This mouse's energy is being transferred to a rattlesnake. So I'm showing energy transfer to the rattlesnake. We would call this rattlesnake a tertiary consumer, or trophic level number 4. And last but not least, this rattlesnake may get eaten by a hawk, which would then be our quaternary consumer, or trophic level 5. So here's an example of a terrestrial food chain and how it would pass from energy from the producer up to the highest consumer. Now let's look at a marine food chain, and I'm going to kind of explain the differences as we go. So phytoplankton, I already said, is a producer at trophic level 1. Phytoplankton are extremely, extremely small, okay? And they actually produce quite a bit of energy, like a lot of energy. So they can be really small and also small in numbers, which we'll talk about when we talk about energy pyramids and number pyramids. Now this phytoplankton produces energy that gets passed to zooplankton, which is our primary consumer, or trophic level 2. Now again, plankton are extremely small. Think of plankton from SpongeBob. He's the smallest character on there. Plankton is very, very, very small. Now let's pretend a clownfish eats that. We're looking at our secondary consumer, or trophic level 3. Now think Nemo, the barracuda comes and eats those, so it's a tertiary consumer at trophic level 4. But killer whales will eat large fish, even seal and stuff like that, so he will be considered our quaternary consumer, or trophic level 5. So here's a marine food chain. Now again, like I was going to say, marine food chains are pretty defined, and so are their food webs, just because you have to think of how big the ocean is. There's not going to be a ton of interaction between all these different organisms, unless they're smaller organisms closer to the shore in like a coral reef. So a food web now takes the model, or our food chain, and what it does is it shows all the energy transfers within that ecosystem. So it takes a bunch of food chains and connects them. So if we're looking at a desert, for example, earlier we said that there was grass to grasshopper to mouse to snake to hawk. So here's my grass, here's my grasshopper. Okay, my grasshopper can be eaten by a lizard, which can be eaten by a hawk. So in this case, we see that food chain. We may also see a rabbit to a hawk. We may see a rabbit to a snake, okay? But essentially, here's my decomposer at the very top, showing that eventually everything is going to be decomposed by the decomposer, okay? So this is the interactions. If I go through, I can literally find a food chain. Star cactus to kangaroo rat to tarantula to rattlesnake. Star cactus to kangaroo rat straight to hawk. Those are two different food chains, but looking at this picture, it's the connection between all of them that makes it a food web. So this is usually showing almost all of the animals within that ecosystem, or specifically that biome, that may interact with one another. So in order, and this is key, I said this is important to understand, in order to understand the difference, the food web is made of food chains. Food chains found within food webs are things like grass rabbit and hawk, star cactus, kangaroo rat, tarantula, rattlesnake, cactus, grasshopper, lizard, hawk. These are food chains that make up a food web. And that is very key to know, because once we start talking about energy transfers and number of pyramid numbers and biomass, this is going to be important to remember that each one of these is individual and it has an effect on each other, because you have to remember a hawk is pretty big for a bird, and it has a variety of different food sources to eat to ensure that it doesn't eliminate one animal from the food chain. Because if a hawk only ate a lizard and eliminated the lizards, the grasshopper population would go rampant. And if you notice, really at this point, the only thing that eats it is the lizard. So if the grasshopper population took over, we would lose grass because they would eat all the grass. Eventually that would have an effect on the rabbit, and the rabbit would have an effect on the rattlesnake. So we have to remember that this connection is all about making sure that animals fill their niches, but also have a variety of different food sources so that competition or that biotic factor doesn't wipe out one population. So you're going to watch this designing a top predator, we call it. Essentially, we want you to look at the characteristics and adaptations that most predators have in common and think about how do these adaptations and characteristics help it be the top predator in its food chain, and what effect does that have on the ecosystem? If you have any questions, please let me know.